This final section of our investigation of freedom of expression and speech. So we talked about previously the role and the importance of freedom of expression, and that there might be some restrictions on that, even though it is considered one of the most important parts, the lifeblood of a democracy. But the US Supreme Court has also made rulings about symbolic speech, about speech that expresses symbols. It's not just about words. And so we want to talk a little bit about some of those. The first one we're going to talk about is flag burning. In two cases, Texas versus Johnson of 1989 and the U.S. versus Eichmann of 1990, we see that the U.S. Supreme Court rulings, 5-4 is usually a controversial ruling. It means that 4 members of the U.S. Supreme Court have ruled against what the majority has decided. And so it certainly has support in the broader society for the positions on both sides of the debate. But in both cases, Texas versus Johnson and U.S. versus Eichmann, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that flag burning, the burning of the flag, as offensive as it might be to a number of people, particularly those who have members who serve in the military or who are themselves in the military, who believe that in fact the burning of the flag, and it shouldn't be something that happens that Americans would do, particularly during wartime. But the idea of burning the flag is and has been of protest in our country and will be allowed, as offensive as it might be. It reminds us that offensive speech is allowed. Speech is allowed even if it's offensive. There are other restrictions that we place on it. And so flag burning, even though a lot of people are against it and really would like to see someone who burns the flag as a protest and pay a fine or something like that, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled in both of these, both at the state level and then at the national level, 1989 and 1990, that the burn the flag protected. That is symbolic speech that is protected. And again, it was very controversial. And it's one that the members of particularly the Republican Party, but there are some Democrats as well, but particularly the Republican Party, that people have in the House of Representatives and sometimes the U.S. Senate have introduced into one of the houses to put a constitutional amendment to turn around and say that burning of the flag is not allowed, that some people feel so strongly we should amend the U.S. Constitution to ban flag burning. And we have a president of the United States right now who has made an argument that he would like to see people who burn the flag punished in some way. And so it is one that's an ongoing. There have never been enough votes to actually propose the amendment to the U.S. Constitution, but it's gotten close. And so some might argue that in a spirit of wartime or something like that, if the United States were ever attacked again, then there might be enough to push it over the edge to propose that amendment to the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled. And unless the U.S. Supreme Court changes its ruling, and it's possible with new members on the U.S. Supreme Court that it could change its ruling, but for now, that's the established interpretation, that freedom of speech includes protection of flag burning. Another area of symbolic speech is one that we're going to talk about more specifically when we talk about Chapter 10, we talk about campaign financing. And I know you're super chomping at the bit to find out about that, but obviously money matters quite a bit in terms of who is elected to certain offices. And so how candidates raise money for their campaigns is an important one, and what those who give money to those campaigns, what they expect in return for their donations, is something we have to care about. But what's interesting about the campaign finance law and the rulings made by the U.S. Supreme Court about campaign finance laws is the way in which they've made some important distinctions. And so what they argued very early on in 1976 in Buckley versus Valeo, they had a 2-part ruling. The first part of that ruling is actually the second part listed on the slide, is to say that candidates running for office are free to spend as much of their own money as they want. There can be no limitations, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, on how much money a candidate spends for his or her own candidacy. They can spend as much of their own money as they want. And some people worry that that means that millionaires have more of a right to run for office than those who don't have jobs that pay them millions of dollars. So in that sense, the ruling is saying that spending your own money on your campaign, spending your own money to get your ideas out because you're running for office, is freedom of speech. That is direct speech. That is protected. But then the question is, how about money that is given to a candidate by someone else? So if I want to give a candidate to Trump to help in his 2020 bid for re-election to make America great again, to continue to make America great again, or I decide that I want to give it to Sanders or Kamala Harris, whoever the Democrats decide will be their nominee for the 2020 election, then the decision is going to be, can I give money to them as I want? Is that also speech? And the U.S. Supreme Court in Buckley versus Valeo argued that that is a form of symbolic speech, and there are some limits to it, amount of money to a candidate, but it's limited. And that limit started at $1,000 for the primary and then another $1,000 for the general election. But over time, the amount of money has increased. So now it is currently around $2,800 for a primary and then another $2,800 for the general election, for a total of $5,600 per candidate per election cycle. And so the argument is that the money you give to a candidate certainly shows your support for them. But if you're allowed to give $100,000 or $1 million, that is just an indication that you are a wealthier individual. And so there should be some restrictions on that. So the U.S. Supreme Court in Buckley versus Valeo had an interesting ruling and said that you're allowed to spend, the candidate can spend as much of his or her own money as they would like on their campaign. But money that is donated to a campaign, that is contributed to a campaign by another individual, that can be limited. And so that was the ruling. Some people argue that Buckley arguing that people have as much speech as they can afford because wealthy individuals have more freedom to spend their own money running for office, as well as we're going to be finding out with campaign finance, is that most people don't give money to candidates. It's only the very wealthy who do. And if money is such an important role in terms of who gets elected, then it might have some influence in terms of how those elected officials will actually act once they're in office. The other one, in terms of campaign finance, is the more recent 2010 ruling of Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. It's another 5-4 controversial decision. 5-4 equals controversial. And that is one in which the U.S. Supreme Court went a lot farther than the plaintiffs actually the defendants thought they were going to go. But in this case, the ruling is that freedom of speech requires that corporations, wealthy individuals, professional organizations, unions, interest groups, all have the right to spend as much money as they would like advocating political views. They need to be independent of the candidates who are running for office. And so if instead of giving money to a campaign, a corporation or a wealthy individual, like Oprah Winfrey or something like that, would like to put together and hire people in favor of a particular candidate, they're free to spend as much money as they want. But what's really controversial about this is part of that list is not simply individuals. That ruling says that corporations, separate from the people who make up those corporations, separate from the CEO, the CFO, and the board of directors, and the people who work for that corporation, they all have freedom of speech rights. But they also argue that institution, the corporations themselves, also have freedom of speech rights. And that's what makes that ruling very controversial. It's one that establishes a freedom of speech to entities that the framers had no intention, didn't even know they existed, because corporations had a very different meaning back in the day. And so they were limited corporations for a specific job, and then they would disband. These corporations that go on beyond a specific task was something beyond what the framers. The U.S. Supreme Court has made a ruling. Some say it's to make it more flexible because our society is one in which corporations do have rights separate from the people who make up them. But others turn around and say that the U.S. Supreme Court in that ruling has established freedom of speech rights, freedom of expression rights for entities that shouldn't be given those. So the final thing is, on this last slide, I have some links to a couple of videos that I'd like you to watch about Citizens United versus the FEC. The first one is more of a documentary. It still has a specific position that it's taking. It's one that clearly you don't have to agree or disagree with the ruling. That's not the role of this class. It's just to think about the underlying issues that are there. It's the story of Citizens United versus the FEC by the Story of Stuff Project. And that is one that talks about, from their perspective, why it's misguided. And it also gives some suggestions about what we might do if we're unhappy with this. If we, the people, are unhappy with the decision made by the U.S. Supreme Court, the part that is the farthest from we, the people, what can we do about that? And so that video gives us a suggestion. But given that their suggestion is to have a proposed constitutional amendment, and given that we know it's really hard to amend the Constitution, we might worry a little bit that that's a bit unrealistic. And what I ask as well is for you to think about, if not a constitutional amendment, what other sort of solutions might there be for campaign finance reform? And we'll talk about that later in the course, and it's in fact one of the discussion board questions later on in the course, thinking about what we might do about the role of money in politics. The other one is called Let Freedom Ka-Ching. It's from the Colbert Report from 2009. So it was actually shown as the oral arguments for the case. The Citizens United case was ruled in 2010, but in 2009 they were doing oral arguments. So on his comedy show, Stephen Colbert on the Colbert Report did this bit called Let Freedom Ka-Ching. And he is doing a satirical way of understanding the underlying reasoning that the US Supreme Court might have used to make a decision in that way. He's pretending to agree with it and to expand, saying that maybe corporations shouldn't just have freedom of speech rights, that it should have other rights as well. And some argue that what he joked about actually might have come into fruition when the US Supreme Court also turned around and said, again, very controversial, a 5-4 decision in the Hobby Lobby case, turned around and said that not only do corporations have freedom of speech rights, but some corporations, particularly those evangelical Christians and Catholics who may have objections to it, they could decide to deny certain sort of health coverage contraception. And so some argue that those corporations were then allowed to have freedom of religion, freedom of religious expression rights that were protected. But anyways, I think that taking a look at how to think about, they are fair game for the exam, take a look at them, think about the issues that are brought up. But they're not that long, and I think they're worth considering.